The glass shattered against the wall, barely missing her head. The ballroom fell silent. Every candle in the grand hall seemed to hold its breath. Dozens of powdered wigs and silk gloves froze in place as Lord Percival Dune hurled the crystal goblet with a cold, practiced aim, not out of rage, but out of habit. This was simply what he did to her. Every time, everywhere, Miss Annette Vail stood perfectly still. She did not flinch. She had learned a long time ago that flinching only made him throw harder. You embarrassed me.
You embarrassed me. Did you really?
Percival said, loud enough for the whole room to hear. His voice was smooth, like honey poured over broken glass. He straightened his cufflinks, smiled at the crowd, and then turned that smile on her like a weapon. Did you really think anyone here wanted to hear you speak?
Did you really think anyone here wanted to hear you speak?
Annette's fingers curled at her sides. Her jaw tightened. She was not going to cry. Not here. Not in front of all these people. Not in front of him. What Percival did not notice, because men like him never noticed anything beyond their own reflection, was the figure standing at the far end of the ballroom, still, watchful, dressed in dark, formal wear that made him look carved from the shadows of the room itself. His Grace, Duke Alaric Montrose, did not move. He held his champagne glass without drinking from it. His eyes were fixed on Annette with an expression that no one in the room could quite read. It was not a pity. It was far too sharp for pity. It was something quieter, something that had been building for a very long time. His jaw tightened when the goblet hit the wall. His grip tightened when Percival smiled. And when Annette lifted her chin and refused to break, something shifted in the Duke's eyes, something that looked very much like a decision being made. Percival had no idea that tonight was the last night he would ever speak to Annette that way in public. He had no idea that the most powerful man in the room had already chosen a side, and it was not his. If a man like that raised his hand against someone he once claimed to love, do you think staying silent was ever really kindness? Drop your thoughts in the comments. We want to know what you think. And if this story already has your heart, please hit the subscribe button and drop a like. Comment where you are watching from. It truly means everything to us. Now, let us get into the story. The morning after the ballroom incident, Annette Vail did not sleep. She sat at the edge of her narrow bed in the small guest room she had been given at Countess Pelham's estate, staring at the wall, listening to the house settle into its night sounds. The fire in the grate had gone cold hours ago. She had not bothered to call for more wood. She did not feel worthy of the warmth. That was what Percival had done to her over 2 years. He had made her feel like an inconvenience in every room she entered, like a smudge on a clean window, like something that needed to be corrected or removed. She pressed her fingers to her temple and breathed slowly. She had met Lord Percival Dune when she was 19. He had been charming then. Everyone said so. He had a laugh that filled rooms and a way of looking at a person that made them feel chosen. She had believed it. She had believed him completely. They had courted for 7 months before the cracks appeared. Small at first. A sharp word here, a cutting remark there, a hand gripping her wrist just a little too tightly when she said something he did not like. By the time the cracks became craters, she was already in too deep. Her father had approved of the match. Her older brother, Lieutenant Dorian Vail, had been away at the Northern Front for most of it, and had no idea what was happening inside the courtship. Her mother had died when she was 12. There was no one to notice the bruises under her long gloves, or the way she flinched at sudden loud sounds. When she finally ended things 8 months ago, Percival had laughed. He had actually laughed. He told her she was nothing without his name attached to hers. He told her no other man of standing would ever look at her twice. He told her she was lucky he had wasted his time on her at all. She had walked out of his drawing room with her hands shaking and her eyes dry, because crying in front of him was something she had promised herself she would never do again. But here she was, 8 months later, and he was still doing it, still finding her at every social event, still making sure the whole room heard his digs, still using public spaces as weapons, because he knew she would not make a scene. She pressed her palms flat against her thighs and made herself breathe again. There was a soft knock at her door. She blinked. It was well past midnight. She rose quickly, pulling her shawl around her shoulders, and opened the door just a crack. It was Dotty, Countess Pelham's young lady's maid, holding a folded note and looking deeply unsettled. "Forgive me, Miss Vail," Dotty whispered. "I was told to deliver this the moment the house was quiet. The footman said it came from someone important. He wouldn't say who." Annette took the note carefully. The paper was thick and cream-coloured. The seal on the back was pressed in dark wax, but had already been broken open, which told her the footman had been too curious for his own good. She thanked Dotty quietly and closed the door. She moved to the window where moonlight fell in a pale silver strip across the floor and unfolded the note. The handwriting was exact, controlled, the kind of penmanship that came from discipline, not elegance. It read, "You are not invisible, Miss Vail, and you are not alone. Those who watch from a distance are not always indifferent. Be careful of Percival Dune. He is planning something worse than words for the Harrington garden party next Thursday. You would do well to prepare yourself, or to simply not attend. The choice is yours. But know that if you do attend, you will not face him without support this time." It was unsigned. Annette read it 3 times. Her heart was hammering so loudly she could hear it in her ears. She turned the note over, checking both sides, examining the seal. The crest pressed into the dark wax was one she recognized. She had seen it only once before, on the doors of a very large, very quiet black carriage that had been parked outside Lady Cheswick's luncheon 2 weeks ago. It belonged to the Duke of Montrose. She sat down hard on the chair beside the window. The Duke of Montrose, His Grace, Alaric Montrose, a man she had never spoken to directly, a man who rarely attended social events, and when he did, stood apart from the crowd like a stone pillar. A man whose name was spoken in drawing rooms with a particular kind of reverence that was almost closer to fear. He had been watching her last night. She had felt it without looking. She had been too focused on not shattering in public to pay it much attention, but she had felt it, the weight of a gaze that was nothing like the others. The others had watched with curiosity or second-hand discomfort, or the particular enjoyment that small people take in witnessing someone else's humiliation. His gaze had felt different. She looked at the note again. He is planning something worse than words. Her mouth went dry. What was Percival planning? She folded the note carefully and pressed it between the pages of the book on her nightstand. She lay down on her bed, with her shawl still wrapped around her, and stared at the ceiling until the pale grey light of morning crept under the curtains. She did not sleep once. By the time the household stirred and breakfast was set in the morning room, Annette had made her decision. She was going to the Harrington garden party. She was done running from rooms. The next morning, she sent a small note of her own. She had no crest and no seal. She used plain paper and her own handwriting, which was loopier and less controlled than his, but clear enough. She wrote, "I will attend, and I will not be hiding in corners this time." She gave it to a trusted boy who ran errands for Countess Pelham and told him to deliver it to Montrose House on the east side of the square. She watched from the window as he disappeared down the lane. Then she turned back to her room and began thinking very carefully about what she would wear, who she would speak to, and exactly how she planned to hold herself when Percival Dune looked at her again, differently. She was going to hold herself completely differently. She just did not yet know that the Duke of Montrose had already started moving pieces on a board that Percival could not even see. Across the city, in a study lined with dark bookshelves and lit by 3 lamps, Duke Alaric Montrose sat at his desk and read her reply twice. The corners of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile. Something quieter than that. He set the note down beside a stack of documents that his secretary, Mr. Farris, had prepared earlier that morning. Among those documents was a full account of Lord Percival Dune's financial dealings, his social debts, and 3 signed testimonies from household staff who had witnessed his behaviour toward Miss Vail during their courtship. Alaric had not gathered these documents out of idle curiosity. He had been gathering them for 6 weeks. He picked up his pen, drew a single line beneath a name on the list in front of him, and said quietly to the empty room, Thursday, then, "Have you or someone close to you experienced this before? How do you feel this is going? If you're still with me till this moment, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on your notifications. I truly appreciate you for sticking around." The Harrington garden party was the kind of event that swallowed people whole. Lady Priscilla Harrington had a gift for making her gatherings feel inevitable. Every important person in the county showed up, not because they were particularly fond of Priscilla, but because not showing up meant being talked about for weeks. The garden itself was enormous, stretching behind the Harrington manor in tiers of sculpted hedgerows and rose beds and little stone pathways that wound around fountains. White pavilion tents had been set up along the eastern hedge. A string quartet played near the centre pond. Servants moved through the crowd, with silver trays carrying glasses and small bites of things that tasted expensive. Annette arrived with Countess Pelham, which was the safest way to enter any social space. The Countess was a small, sharp-eyed woman of 60 who had outlived 2 husbands, survived 3 public scandals, and had opinions about everything and everyone. She was also, beneath her armoured exterior, surprisingly kind to Annette. "Head up," the Countess murmured, as their carriage rolled to a stop. "You are not a woman who apologises for existing. Today of all days, remember that." Annette straightened her spine and stepped out. The garden was already full by the time they arrived. Annette moved with the Countess through the initial crowd, accepting greetings, smiling at the right moments, keeping her shoulders back. She was aware, with every step, of people watching her. After last week's ballroom scene, she had become a subject of conversation. She could tell by the way eyes followed her, and then quickly looked away. She spotted Percival almost immediately. He was standing near the rose arch with 2 of his friends, Lord Basil Trent and Mr. Oliver Quince, both of whom laughed at everything Percival said and believed themselves to be far more interesting than they were. Percival had not spotted her yet. He was performing for a small group nearby, telling some story that was making the ladies around him laugh politely. Then his eyes found her. His expression did not change visibly to anyone watching, but Annette knew that face. She knew the slight tightening of his jaw, the way his posture adjusted, the particular flatness that entered his eyes when he spotted something he wanted to ruin. She held his gaze for exactly 3 seconds and then looked deliberately away. Her heart was pounding, but her face gave nothing. On the other side of the garden, standing near the far pavilion tent with a glass he had not touched, and a gaze that moved across the space with quiet precision, the Duke of Montrose watched the exchange. Beside him stood his closest friend and occasional adviser, Lord Graham Ashby, a tall, talkative man with red hair and an inability to stay still for more than 30 seconds at a time. "She came," Graham said, sounding surprised. "I told you she would," Alaric replied, without looking at him. "You also told me not to interfere today. I want it on record that staying still while that man breathes the same air as her, is physically painful for me. Noted. Stay still, anyway. Graham sighed loudly. When exactly does your plan begin? When it needs to. Across the garden, things were already beginning to move. Percival had detached himself from his group and was making his way through the crowd in Annette's direction. He moved unhurriedly, stopping to greet people, which made it look casual. But Annette could track his approach, because she had learned to track it over 2 years. She could feel him moving toward her the way you feel a shift in temperature before a storm. Countess Pelham had been pulled into a conversation with Lady Harrington herself, which left Annette standing slightly apart from the main group near a stone bench and a climbing rose hedge. Percival stopped beside her. He did not announce himself. He simply appeared at her elbow the way bad news always does. You look tired, Annette, he said pleasantly. He always opened with something that sounded like concern. Are you sleeping badly again? She turned to face him slowly. Lord Dune, is that formal already? He smiled. The smile never reached his eyes. We were together for 7 months. You can still use my given name. I prefer not to, she said. He glanced around at the nearby guests, making sure people could hear without looking like he was making sure. That was his particular skill. Performing cruelty in front of witnesses while making it look like conversation. I heard you've been staying at Pelham House, he said. Is the dear Countess your guardian now? Poor Annette, still unable to manage on her own. I manage perfectly well, she said. Do you? He tilted his head. Because from where I was standing last week, you looked very much like a woman who had no idea what to do with herself, standing in the middle of a ballroom with nowhere to go and no one to turn to. He lowered his voice just enough to sound intimate. It was rather sad to watch. Something sharp moved through her chest, but she kept her face still. I wonder, she said, quietly enough that only he could hear. If you speak this way because it is the only power you have ever known, that would be quite sad for you. His eyes went flat. That was new. She had never answered him back like that before. She had always gone quiet or turned away. He had not expected words. Before he could respond, a voice behind Annette spoke. Miss Vail. It was calm, unhurried. It carried across the small space between the hedgerows with the kind of natural authority that cannot be practiced or performed. It simply existed. Annette turned. Duke Alaric Montrose stood 3 feet away, looking directly at her. He was tall, dark-haired, and had a face that was too composed to be called warm, but too attentive to be called cold. He was looking at her the way a person looks at something they have been thinking about for a long time. I believe we have not been formally introduced, he said. I am Montrose. He did not add the title. He did not need to. Annette felt the air in the garden change. Around them, people had noticed. Of course they had noticed. The Duke of Montrose did not approach people at garden parties. The Duke of Montrose stood at a distance and let people approach him, and most of them were afraid to. Miss Annette Vail, she said, and her voice was steadier than she expected. It is an honour, Your Grace. He gave a small nod, and then, with the most natural movement in the world, offered her his arm. I was hoping you might walk with me, he said. I find the rose section along the west hedge is particularly worth seeing this time of year. Would you allow me to show you? It was a question, but it was also something else. It was a door, opened quietly, in the middle of a space that had felt like a closing trap. Annette looked at his arm. She looked at his face. She saw nothing that frightened her, which was more than she could say for most men. She placed her hand on his arm. I would like that, she said. Percival said nothing. He could not say anything. There was nothing a man like him could say in response to a duke extending his arm to the woman he had just been dismantling with pointed pleasantries. The entire nearby crowd had seen it. Graham Ashby, from his position near the pavilion, watched with quiet satisfaction as Percival's expression cracked for just a moment before he smoothed it back into place. Alaric walked with Annette toward the west hedge without looking back at Percival once. "Are you all right?" he asked, when they were far enough from the crowd that the question could be asked plainly. "I am," she said. Then, because he had been honest with her in his note and she felt she owed him the same, she added, "I was frightened for a moment, but I did not show it." "No," he agreed, "you did not." They walked in silence for a moment through the stone path between the rose beds. She was aware of how different this felt from any other conversation she had been having for months. There was no performance here, no positioning, just two people walking and speaking plainly. "You mentioned in your note that he was planning something worse," she said carefully, "not just words." Alaric's jaw tightened slightly. "There is a rumour he intends to spread, a specific one, about your conduct during your courtship. He has been speaking to a journalist who writes for one of the more damaging society columns. He wants to damage your reputation thoroughly enough that no decent household will receive you." Annette stopped walking. The blood left her face. She stared at the rosebed in front of her without seeing it. "He cannot do that," she said, though her voice came out smaller than she wanted. "He can try," Alaric said, "but he will find it significantly more difficult than he expects." She turned to look at him. "What have you done?" "I have had a conversation with the journalist's employer," Alaric said simply. "The column in question will not be running any story involving your name. The employer was very understanding once I explained my interest in the matter." Annette stared at him. She did not know what to say. She had been managing her world alone for so long that someone stepping between her and danger without being asked felt almost incomprehensible. "Why?" she asked. It came out before she could shape it into something more polished. "Why would you do that? We have never spoken before today." Alaric was quiet for a moment. The string quartet floated toward them in the afternoon air, soft and unhurried. "I have watched what that man does to you for 4 months," he said. "Every event I have attended where you were present. He uses crowds as weapons. He times his cruelties for maximum witness. He is very deliberate about it." Something moved in his eyes. "I do not find deliberate cruelty easy to observe without wanting to do something about it." Annette felt something happen in her chest that she could not name. It was not gratitude exactly. It was something older and quieter than gratitude. It was the feeling of being seen, actually seen, by someone who had chosen to look. "I do not want to be a project," she said quietly. She needed to say it. "I do not want to be something you are fixing out of principle." He looked at her directly. "You are not a project, Miss Vail, I assure you." She held his gaze. The afternoon light fell through the rose hedge in thin gold lines. Somewhere behind them, the garden party continued its noise and its performance. But here, on this stone path between the roses, something quieter and far more significant had just begun. "He is going to retaliate," she said. "Once he realizes you have stepped in." "I know," Alaric said. "I am counting on it." She blinked. "You want him to retaliate?" Something shifted in his expression, not quite a smile. That same movement she was starting to recognize. A man who retaliates shows his full hand. And Percival Dune's full hand is something I have been waiting very patiently to see. Annette looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, with the first real feeling of steadiness she had experienced in months, "Then I suppose we had better give him something to react to." Alaric looked at her. The almost smile deepened by precisely the smallest amount. "Indeed," he said, "we had better." The garden party ended quietly, but the storm it started was anything but quiet. By the following morning, every drawing room in the county was buzzing with the same piece of news. The Duke of Montrose had walked with Miss Annette Vail along the west rose hedge for 30 full minutes. He had brought her a glass of lemonade from one of the silver trays. He had introduced her to his aunt, Lady Constance Montrose, a formidable woman who had the power to open or close every important door in society, simply by choosing whether or not to smile at someone. Lady Constance had smiled at Annette, warmly, in front of at least 14 witnesses. That single smile was worth more than 100 cutting remarks from Percival Dune. Annette knew this. She sat in the Countess Pelham's morning room with a cup of tea she kept forgetting to drink and thought carefully about what had shifted. Something had. The air around her felt different. The way the Countess's own household staff greeted her that morning had been subtly altered. There was a new kind of attentiveness in it. She was not naive enough to believe it was all about her. It was about him, about the weight of his attention and what it signalled to everyone watching. "You handled yourself beautifully yesterday," Countess Pelham said from across the breakfast table, folding her morning paper with the sharp efficiency of someone who had been reading bad news for decades and had learned not to flinch at it. "Montrose does not walk with women at parties. Not ever. The last time he was seen paying specific attention to any female at a social event was 3 years ago, and that turned out to be his cousin who had twisted her ankle." Annette looked at the Countess carefully. "Are you warning me about something?" "I am telling you to be clear about what you want," the Countess said. "Because that man does nothing without purpose. If he stepped into your path yesterday, it was not an accident, and it was not entirely charity." She picked up her teacup. "What did he say to you on that walk?" Annette considered how much to share. Then she said, "He told me Percival was planning to ruin my reputation through a society column. He said he had already stopped it." The Countess set her cup down slowly. "He did what?" He spoke to the journalist's employer. Silence filled the room for a long moment. The fire crackled in the grate. Outside, a carriage rolled past on the cobbled street. "Alaric Montrose," the Countess said finally, in the tone of someone solving a puzzle they had not expected to find interesting, "has been quietly watching you for months and spent political capital protecting your name before you even knew he existed." She looked at Annette steadily. "My dear girl, you need to decide very quickly how you feel about that." Annette opened her mouth, then closed it. She did not have an answer yet, but the question sat in her chest and burned there warmly, which was itself an answer of some kind. What she did have, by noon that same day, was a visitor she had not expected. The card that was brought to her on a small silver tray read, "Miss Dorothea Ashby," which meant nothing to Annette until the Countess appeared at the doorway with an expression of genuine surprise and said, "That is Graham Ashby's younger sister. She never calls on anyone uninvited. Show her in immediately, and for heaven's sake pour fresh tea." Dorothea Ashby was 23, had her brother's red hair and none of his inability to stay still. She was composed and quick-eyed, and she sat across from Annette in the Countess's front parlour with the air of someone who had come with a specific purpose and intended to fulfil it efficiently. "Miss Vail," she said, after the pleasantries had been exchanged, "I will be direct with you because I find indirection exhausting. My brother asked me to call on you, not because he thinks you need handling, but because he believes you could use a friend in the right circles, and I happen to agree with him after yesterday." Annette studied her. "Lord Ashby sent you?" He suggested it. "I chose to come." Dorothea tilted her head slightly. "There is a difference. I do not do things simply because my brother suggests them. I came because I watched what happened at the Harrington party, and I have watched what Percival Dune has been doing to you for months, and I find it deeply offensive." Her voice was steady, but there was heat underneath it. I also know things about Lord Dune that I think you should know. Annette's spine straightened. What things? Dorothea glanced toward the door, then back. She lowered her voice only slightly, just enough to signal seriousness rather than secrecy. Percival Dune is in significant debt, she said. Not modest debt, catastrophic debt. He owes money to 3 separate creditors, 2 of whom are not the kind of men who accept letters of apology. He has been looking for a wealthy match for over a year. Every woman he has targeted socially, since you ended things with him, has had one thing in common: money. Old money or new money, he is not particular. She paused. The reason he has been dismantling you publicly is not heartbreak. It is a strategy. He needs you discredited before you can speak about what happened during your courtship, because there are things that happened that, if told properly, would make him unmarriageable. The room felt very still. Annette thought about the bruises under her long gloves, about the wrist gripping, about the raised voice in closed rooms, and the particular way he had made her feel like the problem was always her. He is afraid of me, she said slowly. It was the first time she had ever framed it that way. Terrified, Dorothea said simply. Men like him always are. Once the woman they underestimated starts standing upright. Something moved through Annette then. Not rage, not yet. Something quieter and more dangerous than rage. Clarity. There is more, Dorothea said. He has a meeting scheduled for this Friday with Baron Rupert Gale, who is one of his creditors. Gale has been pressuring him to produce results, meaning a wealthy engagement, within the next 30 days, or he calls in the debt publicly. Percival is running out of time. A desperate man does desperate things, Miss Vail. Whatever he tried at the garden party was only the beginning. Annette looked at Dorothea for a long moment. Why is the Duke of Montrose involved in all of this? She asked. What is his connection to Percival? Dorothea was quiet for a moment. Then she said, carefully, That is not entirely my story to tell. But I will say this. There is history between them, old history. And Alaric Montrose is a man who waits a very long time before he acts. But when he acts, he does not stop halfway. Annette filed that away. She would come back to it. What do you need from me? She asked Dorothea. Nothing yet, Dorothea said. But I think very soon we are going to need you to be willing to speak. Not to a journalist, not to a column. To the right people, in the right room, at the right moment. She met Annette's eyes. Can you do that? Annette thought about the ballroom, the shattered goblet, the garden party. The note was written in controlled handwriting on thick cream paper. She thought about the feeling of placing her hand on a duke's arm and walking away from Percival Dune without flinching. Yes, she said, I can do that. Dorothea smiled. It transformed her face entirely. Good. Then we have work to do. That same afternoon, in his study at Montrose House, Alaric sat across from his younger brother, Lord Sebastian Montrose, who had arrived unannounced from his country estate and was currently occupying the best chair in the room, with his coat still on and an expression of deep concern. Sebastian was 27, 3 years younger than Alaric, and where Alaric was still and quiet, Sebastian was expressive and restless. He cared about his brother in the loud, inconvenient way that younger siblings often do. Tell me this is not what I think it is, Sebastian said. Tell me what you think it is, Alaric replied, without looking up from his documents. You are personally involving yourself in a social campaign against Percival Dune on behalf of a woman you have never spoken to until yesterday. Sebastian leaned forward. Alaric, that is exactly what I think it is it not? I spoke to her yesterday. For the first time, Timing is a matter of readiness, Alaric said calmly. I was not ready before yesterday. Sebastian stared at him. Ready for what exactly? Alaric set down his pen and looked at his brother directly. Sebastian, to his credit, did not look away, even though Alaric's direct gaze was something that made most people want to study the carpet. Percival Dune destroyed a woman I have been watching him destroy for months, Alaric said. He is also the same man who spread the false account about father's business dealings 4 years ago that cost us significantly in Parliament. You remember that? Sebastian's jaw tightened. I remember. He was never held accountable for it. I have been patient. I have waited for the right circumstances, the right moment, and the right position from which to dismantle him properly and permanently. Alaric's voice remained level. Miss Vail's situation and our own outstanding matter with Dune have become, through circumstance, connected. I am addressing both. Sebastian was quiet for a moment. Then he said, more gently, And is that all she is? A circumstance? Alaric looked at him for a long moment. No, he said. That is not all she is. Sebastian sat back slowly. Something shifted in his expression, the concern not disappearing but changing shape into something that looked almost like relief. Then you had better not make a mess of it, he said. I do not make messes, Alaric said, and picked up his pen again. Sebastian almost smiled. No, you just rearranged them into something unrecognizable. He stood, finally removing his coat. All right, what do you need me to do? Friday arrived cold and overcast, the kind of morning that made carriages feel like moving boxes of grey light. Annette had not been idle since her conversation with Dorothea. She had spent 3 days quietly and carefully doing exactly what needed to be done. She had written 2 letters, one to her brother Dorian, now returned from the Northern Front and stationed in London, telling him she needed to see him urgently, and asking him to come to Pelham House as soon as possible. The second letter went to a woman named Mrs. Helena Price, who had been a close friend of her mother's, and was now one of the more respected hostesses in the city, a woman whose opinion carried genuine weight in the circles that mattered. She had also, at Dorothea's suggestion, written down everything she remembered, every incident, every date she could recall, every witness who had been present at any moment when Percival had been cruel to her in public. She had written it in plain language, without drama or embellishment, because plain language, as Dorothea pointed out, was far more credible than anything that sounded rehearsed. She had 12 pages by the time she was done. Holding those 12 pages in her hands felt like holding something that had lived inside her body for 2 years and had finally been given a shape it could exist outside of her. Dorian arrived on Thursday evening. Lieutenant Dorian Vail was 26, lean, sun-darkened from months in the north, and looked enough like Annette that strangers often identified them as siblings before being told. He had her same jaw and her same eyes, but carried himself with the particular uprightness of someone trained to enter dangerous rooms and stay alive in them. He read her 12 pages in silence, standing by the window in the Countess's front parlour. Annette sat across from him and watched his face. She saw the moment he reached the first incident. She saw what happened to his expression when he reached the second. By the time he reached the 6th page, his hands were completely still, which was how she knew he was furious, because Dorian went very still when he was at his most dangerous. He looked up when he finished. How long did you know about this? He asked. His voice was quiet and controlled. Pieces of it since it started, she said. All of it, clearly, only once I was out of it. Why did you not write to me? You were at the front, she said. There was nothing you could have done from there, and I did not want you to do something that would end your career or your freedom on my behalf. He stared at her. Annette! I am telling you now, she said, because now there is something useful you can do. He sat down heavily in the chair across from her. He pressed his hands together and looked at the floor for a long moment. When he looked up again, the wildness in his eyes had been brought back under control. "What do you need?" he said. "I need you to come with me to a gathering at Montrose House next Tuesday," she said. "And I need you to meet some people. And I need you to trust that this is being handled in the right way." Dorian looked at her carefully. "Montrose House," he repeated. "You are connected to the Duke of Montrose?" "I am becoming connected to him," Annette said. "It is a recent development." Her brother studied her face for a long moment with the particular attention of someone trained to read situations quickly. Then he said, "Is he good to you?" The question was so simply put that it almost undid her. After everything, after 2 years of someone being systematically unkind to her, her brother's first question about any new man in her life was simply whether he was good to her. "Yes," she said, "he is." Dorian nodded once. "Then I will come on Tuesday." Friday morning, Percival Dune arrived at the offices of Baron Rupert Gale at 10 o'clock precisely. Baron Gale's offices were in the financial district, 3 floors above a banking house, and had the particular atmosphere of rooms where bad news is delivered professionally. Gale himself was a heavy-set man of 55, with small eyes, and the particular patience of someone who had spent decades watching people squirm across from his desk. Percival sat down and placed his hands flat on the table, which was his tell when he was trying to project confidence he did not fully have. "I have a prospect," Percival said. "Miss Augusta Fenmore. Her father made his fortune in textiles. It is new money, but it is substantial. I have been in conversation with the family for 3 weeks." Gale looked at him without expression. "Miss Fenmore became engaged to a Mr. Theodore Hale of Bristol last Tuesday," he said. "I keep very current information, Lord Dune. You would do well to remember that." The colour drained from Percival's face by precisely 1 shade. "There are other prospects," he said. "You have 30 days, Gale said. 27 now, to be accurate. I am not in the business of extensions." He folded his hands on his desk. "I am, however, in the business of alternatives. If an engagement is not forthcoming, there is one other arrangement that would satisfy the debt." Percival went very still. "What arrangement?" "There is a property in your name," Gale said. "Dune Hall, the northern estate. Its value would cover what you owe, with some remainder." He tilted his head. "Sign it over. Debt cleared. No engagement required." Percival stared at him. Dune Hall was the only thing left that connected him to his family name in any meaningful way. Losing it would mean losing the last piece of his identity that made him worth anything in social circles. "I will find an engagement," Percival said. 27 days, Gale said pleasantly. "Good morning, Lord Dune." Percival left the building with his jaw tight and his mind moving at speed. He needed a wealthy match. He needed one quickly, and he needed the field cleared of anyone who might speak against him before he could secure it. Which brought him, inevitably, back to Annette Vail. She had not been discredited yet. The column had fallen through, and he had not yet discovered why. She had stood up to him at the garden party in a way she never had before, and she had walked away on the arm of Alaric Montrose, which was the kind of image that stuck in people's minds like a splinter. He needed to understand what had changed. He needed information. He summoned Mr. Oliver Quince that same afternoon, not to his home, but to a private dining room at his club, which he only did when he wanted the conversation to stay off any record. Quince arrived looking eager in the way that people look eager when they are being made to feel useful by someone they admire and are slightly afraid of. "I need you to find out everything about Montrose's connection to Miss Vail," Percival said, before Quince had fully settled into his seat. "How long has it been developing, who introduced them, and what he is actually after?" He does not involve himself in other people's affairs without a reason. I want to know the reason." Quince nodded rapidly. "Of course. I can make some inquiries through—" "Quietly," Percival interrupted. "Not through gossip. Through people who work in or near Montrose house. Staff talk to staff. Someone will know something." Quince's expression flickered. "That is a bit." 24 hours, Percival said. "I need something useful within 24 hours. Quince nodded again and left quickly. Percival sat alone in the private dining room for a moment after he left. He poured himself a glass from the decanter on the sideboard and stood at the window looking down at the street below. He was not afraid of Montrose. He told himself this clearly and deliberately. Montrose was powerful, yes, but power had pressure points, just like everything else. Every man had something he wanted protected. You simply had to find it. He would find it. What Percival did not know, because he had no way of knowing it, was that the footman he had bribed 2 weeks ago to keep him informed about movements at Montrose house had gone to Alaric's secretary, Mr. Farris, the very morning after being approached, and had told him everything, including Percival's questions, including the amount he had been offered. Mr. Farris had informed Alaric immediately. Alaric had thanked the footman, doubted whatever Percival had offered him, and told him to continue as normal and report anything further that came through. By Friday afternoon, when Quince went looking for useful staff contacts near Montrose house, every single person he approached had already been quietly spoken to. They were pleasant. They were willing to talk. And every piece of information they gave Quince was precisely what Alaric had prepared them to give. Not lies, simply a very carefully curated version of the truth. By Saturday morning, Percival had received Quince's report and believed he understood the situation. He believed Montrose's interest in Annette was social positioning, a calculated effort to use her as a pawn in some broader political manoeuvre that Percival had not yet mapped. He believed Annette herself was not truly under Montrose's protection, but was simply being used as a visible piece on a board she did not understand. He believed, in short, exactly what Alaric had wanted him to believe, and so he began to plan his next move on the basis of entirely false information, with 26 days left on his debt, and the absolute certainty that he was the smartest person in the room. He was not. On Saturday evening, Annette received a second note from Alaric. This one was shorter than the first. It read, "He has taken the bait. Stay close to the Countess this week, and do not attend anything without her. Tuesday's gathering at Montrose house is where it ends. Come at 7. Bring your brother." She read it once. Then she set it in the fire and watched it burn. She turned back to her window and looked out at the evening street below, where lamplighters were making their quiet rounds and the city was settling into its night sounds. Tuesday, she thought. 4 more days. She pressed her hand briefly to her chest, feeling her own heartbeat, steady and determined beneath her palm. She was ready. Monday arrived the way the last quiet day before a battle always does, deceptively still, almost gentle. Annette spent the morning with Dorothea at Pelham House, going over everything one final time. They sat close together at the small writing table in the Countess's study, with Annette's 12 pages spread between them and Dorothea's own notes laid alongside them in neat columns. Mrs. Helena Price had confirmed she would attend Tuesday's gathering. Dorian had confirmed his attendance twice, because he was a soldier, and soldiers confirmed things twice. Lady Constance Montrose had sent a brief, elegant card to Countess Pelham, saying she looked forward to the evening, which the Countess received with the quiet satisfaction of someone watching a very good play come together in its final act. "He will be there," Dorothea said, tapping one finger lightly on the table. "Percival. He will find a way to get himself invited, or to insert himself into the evening somehow. He cannot afford not to be present once he hears whose names are on the guest list. How will he hear? Annette asked. Dorothea looked at her with a small, precise smile. Because Graham is going to mention it loudly at his club this afternoon, in the specific company of Lord Basil Trent, who tells Percival everything within 3 hours of hearing it. Annette stared at her. You have all been doing this for a while, haven't you? Alaric has been building this for 6 weeks, Dorothea said simply. The rest of us joined at different points. Graham first, then myself, then Sebastian. She paused. You are the last piece, Miss Vail, the most important one. Everything else is scaffolding. You are the structure. Annette looked down at her 12 pages. At the plain, careful language she had used to describe 2 years of being slowly taken apart by someone who had smiled at her while doing it. I am frightened, she said. Not as a confession, just as a fact. Good, Dorothea said. Frightened people pay attention. Frightened people do not miss anything. She reached across the table and placed her hand briefly over Annette's. You have already done the hardest part. You wrote it all down. Tomorrow you simply say it out loud. Annette nodded. She gathered the pages together carefully and folded them into the inner pocket of her coat. In the afternoon, she walked with Dorian through the small park 2 streets from Pelham House. They walked without speaking much at first, the way siblings do when they have too much to say and are not sure where to start. The park was mostly empty at that hour. A nursemaid pushed a perambulator along the far path. 2 old men played cards at a stone table near the fountain. I met Montrose briefly this morning, Dorian said eventually. Annette turned to look at him quickly. You did? Where? He called at Pelham House while you were with Miss Ashby upstairs, Dorian said. The Countess received him in the front parlour. I happened to be there. He paused, choosing his next words in the careful way he always did when something had genuinely surprised him. He is not what I expected. What did you expect? Someone colder, Dorian said. He has that reputation, unreachable, severe. But he sat across from me and spoke about you the way a man speaks about something he is determined to protect carefully, not possessively, carefully. There is a difference. He looked at her sideways. He asked me about your childhood, about what you were like before all of this. Annette felt something warm move through her chest and settle there. What did you tell him? The truth, Dorian said. That you were the most stubborn, most quietly brave person I had ever known, and that I had failed to protect that properly. His voice went slightly rough at the edges. He told me I had not failed, that you had protected yourself, that the fact that you were still standing and still fighting was entirely your own doing. He glanced at her. I decided then that I liked him. Annette looked ahead at the path in front of her. Her eyes were stinging, and she refused to let them do anything further about it. He is a good man, she said quietly. Yes, Dorian agreed. I believe he is. They walked the rest of the path in comfortable silence, and it was the most peaceful Annette had felt in 2 years. That evening, Percival Dune sat in his private study and unfolded the list of names attending the following night's gathering at Montrose House, which Trent had obtained through his own channels and delivered with the eagerness of a dog retrieving something it was proud of. Percival read through the list. Baron Rupert Gale's name was not on it, which was a relief, but almost every other name of consequence in the county was. Mrs. Helena Price, Lady Constance Montrose, Countess Pelham, Lord Graham Ashby and his sister, Lord Sebastian Montrose, Lieutenant Dorian Vail. He stopped at that name, Dorian Vail, Annette's brother, returned from the north and apparently already embedded in Montrose's social circle. Percival set the list down and thought carefully. His first instinct was to find a reason not to attend, but his second instinct, the one that had always driven him, told him that absence was weakness, that if he stayed away, the room would construct a narrative about him without him in it to control any part of it. He needed to be there. He needed to walk into that room and demonstrate that he was unbothered and untouched and still the man others deferred to. He sent a note to Lord Sebastian Montrose, whom he had met twice at other gatherings and with whom he had a surface-level acquaintance, expressing interest in the evening and angling for an invitation with the particular combination of flattery and assumption that he had always found effective. Sebastian received the note, read it, and brought it directly to Alaric. Alaric read it once, handed it back, and said, "Invite him." Sebastian raised his eyebrows. "You want him in the room?" "I have always wanted him in the room," Alaric said. "I have spent 6 weeks making sure he would want to be there." Sebastian stared at his brother for a moment. Then he shook his head slowly and went to write the reply. Percival received his invitation by 9 o'clock that evening and spent the rest of the night feeling like he had won something. He had not won anything. He had simply walked, of his own free will, into the room where everything was waiting for him. Tuesday evening descended over the city with a particular cold clarity that made the lit windows of Montrose House glow warmly against the dark street. Carriages arrived in a steady procession. Footmen in formal livery helped guests down the steps. The house itself was exactly what it looked like from the outside, old, large, and completely certain of itself. Annette arrived with Countess Pelham and Dorian at 5 minutes past 7. She wore her best evening gown and had allowed the Countess's maid to dress her hair in a style that was simple but deliberate. She carried nothing except a small evening bag in which the folded 12 pages sat alongside a handkerchief she hoped she would not need. The entry hall of Montrose House was all dark wood and high ceilings, and the kind of quiet grandeur that required nothing to prove. Alaric stood near the base of the main staircase, receiving his guests, which was not something he typically did at his own gatherings, according to Dorothea, who had told her this specifically so that Annette would understand what it meant. When he saw her, something shifted in his face, quick and private, there and then controlled again. He crossed the entry hall toward her. "Miss Vail," he said. Then, with a small inclination of his head, "Lieutenant Vail, I am glad you are both here." "Your Grace," Dorian said, and the two men looked at each other with the direct, assessing quality of people who had already decided to trust each other and were simply confirming it in person. Alaric turned to Annette. "Are you ready?" She met his eyes. "Yes," she said, "completely." He offered her his arm, and she took it, and they walked together into the main reception room, where 40 people turned to notice, and the evening truly began. The reception room at Montrose House was long and warmly lit, with high windows along one wall and portraits along the other. The guests moved through it in the usual patterns of such gatherings, small groups forming and dissolving, conversations layering over each other, the string trio in the corner providing a current of sound beneath everything else. Annette moved through the room at Alaric's side for the first quarter hour, and she felt the temperature of the space shift around them as they moved. People greeted her differently here than they had anywhere else, with genuine warmth rather than polite distance. Lady Constance, stationed near the fireplace like a general at her post, caught Annette's eye and gave her a slow, deliberate nod that communicated more than most people managed with full sentences. Mrs. Helena Price found her near the window alcove and embraced her with the particular warmth of someone who had known her mother. "Your mother would be proud of you tonight," Helena said quietly, holding both of Annette's hands. "She would be so proud." Annette pressed her hands back and did not trust herself to speak for a moment. Percival arrived at 7:30. She felt the room register his arrival before she saw him. A slight shifting in the crowd near the entrance, a few heads turning. She turned too, because she was done pretending she could not feel him enter a space. He was dressed well, as always. He moved through the entry with his usual confident ease, scanning the room with the practiced social intelligence that was the most genuinely impressive thing about him. He found Annette quickly. His gaze moved to Alaric beside her, and stayed there for a fraction longer than was natural, and then he smiled his smooth smile and began moving through the crowd to greet people. Lord Basil Trent was with him. So was a man Annette did not recognise, introduced later as Mr. Clement Furse, a solicitor who had accompanied Percival to several recent social engagements, and whose presence Graham Ashby noted and reported quietly to Alaric within 10 minutes of their arrival. Alaric listened, said nothing, and moved Annette gently toward the far end of the room, where a small cluster of the most important people of the evening had gathered. Baron Gale was not a guest, but his absence was, in its own way, as present as anything else in the room, because 3 people at the gathering knew the details of Percival's debt and the 25-day deadline, and those 3 people had positioned themselves with careful intention. The gathering had been in motion for 40 minutes when Alaric touched Annette's arm lightly and said, so quietly that only she heard, "It is time." She breathed in slowly, breathed out. She crossed the room to where Lady Constance stood with Mrs. Helena Price and Countess Pelham, and when she reached them, she did not wait for anyone to invite her to speak. She stood straight, and she began. She did not shout. She did not perform. She spoke in the plain, clear language she had used to write her 12 pages. And she spoke to these 3 women specifically, but in a room with the particular acoustics that Montrose House had always had, where sound carried in ways that appeared accidental, her voice reached further than just the 3 of them. She talked about the courtship, about the first time Percival had gripped her wrist, about the raised voices in closed rooms, about the public humiliations timed for maximum witness, about the ballroom and the goblet, about the garden party and the words designed to reduce her in front of a crowd, about the plan to ruin her reputation through a society column, and what that plan had revealed about how afraid he was of her having a voice. She spoke for 7 minutes. She did not rush, and she did not falter. Lady Constance's expression did not change during any of it, but her eyes sharpened progressively with each sentence, the way a hawk's does when it has located exactly what it was looking for. Mrs. Helena Price's face went through several stages of emotion that she did not attempt to suppress. By the end, her jaw was set, and her eyes were bright with the particular fury of a woman who had known Annette since childhood and was now in full possession of facts she intended to act on. Countess Pelham stood with her hands folded and her head slightly tilted, and the expression of someone filing every word into permanent, actionable memory. On the other side of the room, Percival became aware that something was happening. He could not hear the words, but he could read the body language of the women listening, and something cold moved through his chest. He started toward the group. Dorian stepped into his path. Not aggressively, simply present, filling the space between Percival and his sister with the calm, physical certainty of a man trained to hold positions under pressure. "Lieutenant Vail," Percival said, keeping his voice smooth. "I did not know you were acquainted with Montrose." "My sister introduced us," Dorian said pleasantly. "She is very good at recognizing good men, and the other kind." The 2 held each other's gaze. Percival looked away first. He tried to move around Dorian. Lord Graham Ashby materialized on the other side of him, holding a glass and wearing an expression of elaborate social innocence that was so perfectly performed it was almost an art form. "Dune," Graham said warmly. I have been meaning to ask you about the Langham investment. Fascinating situation. How is that progressing? Percival stared at him. The Langham investment was connected to one of his creditors. Graham could not possibly know about it unless he had been looking very specifically in directions Percival had considered private. I am not sure what you mean, Percival said. Of course, Graham said easily. Must have been confused with someone else. Easy mistake. He sipped his drink. Enjoying the evening? Across the room, Annette finished speaking. The silence that followed lasted only a few seconds, but those seconds had weight. Then Lady Constance said, in a voice that was quiet and absolutely final, I see. She looked at Mrs. Price and then at the Countess. I think we have heard enough to be very clear about where the truth of this matter lies. Mrs. Price reached out and took Annette's hand briefly. You were very brave tonight, she said. Your mother's daughter entirely. Alaric crossed the room and came to stand beside Annette. He did not make a show of it. He simply came to stand beside her, which, in its quietness, was more powerful than any gesture he could have made. Percival saw him do it from across the room. He saw Lady Constance's face. He saw Mrs. Price. He saw the Countess. He saw Dorian and Graham on either side of him, and Sebastian Montrose emerging from a conversation nearby to complete a circle that had been placed around him so gradually and so expertly that he had walked into the centre of it, believing himself to be the one doing the manoeuvring. He understood at that moment that he had not been invited to this gathering as a guest. He had been invited as a conclusion. His face went through three things in quick succession: disbelief, then fury, then the particular blankness of a man recalculating in real time and finding that the numbers no longer work in any direction he looks. This is not over, he said, and his voice had finally lost its smoothness. It came out too low and too tight, and several people nearby heard it and would remember it later. Lord Dune, Alaric said from across the room. His voice carried without effort. I think you will find that it is. He did not shout it. He did not need to. He said it the way people state facts that require no argument, and the room heard it, and Percival heard it, and the truth of it settled over everything like something that had always been inevitable. Percival left the gathering 11 minutes later. Trent followed him out. Mr. Clement Furse, the solicitor, stayed behind for a further 20 minutes and had a quiet conversation with Sebastian Montrose near the window that Annette was not party to, but whose outcome she would learn about the next morning. What she learned was this. Furse had been retained by Percival to explore legal options against both Annette and Alaric for interference with his social and financial prospects. What Furse had not known, until Sebastian explained it to him calmly beside the window, was that two of the three creditors pressing Percival for repayment had already sold their debt notes to a third party. That third party had now called in the full combined amount, effective immediately, which meant Percival had not 25 days, but no days. The third party was a financial holding managed quietly and at considerable arm's length from Montrose House. Annette sat with this information the following morning in the Countess's front parlour and felt something release inside her that she had not realised she had been holding in tension for 2 years. Not triumph. Not satisfaction exactly. Something simpler than both of those things. Something that felt, at its core, like the first full breath she had taken in a very long time. The Countess set a fresh cup of tea in front of her and sat down across from her and said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "What will you do now?" Annette thought about it genuinely. "I would like to find a house to lease," she said. "Something small and my own, with a garden, if possible." She paused. "And I would like to continue being in the company of people who look at me as though I am worth looking at." The Countess smiled. It was the realest smile Annette had ever seen on her face. "Both of those things seem entirely achievable," she said. 3 days after the gathering, Alaric called at Pelham House at 11 in the morning. He was shown to the small sitting room at the back of the house that overlooked the walled garden, and he sat across from Annette in the good chair the Countess always reserved for important guests, and held his hat in his hands in the manner of a man who was, for possibly the first time in a very long time, not entirely certain of the outcome of a situation. Annette found this so unexpectedly endearing that she had to look at the window for a moment to keep her face from showing everything at once. "I wanted to see how you were," he said. "You could have sent a note," she said. "I could have," he agreed. "I chose not to." She looked at him. He looked at her. Outside, the walled garden was doing the first tentative things that gardens do at the edge of a new season, small and green, and entirely unconcerned with anything happening indoors. "I want to say something to you," he said. "And I want to say it plainly, without any of the scaffolding we have been operating around for the past 2 weeks. Please," she said. "I did not begin watching out for you because of Percival Dune," he said. "I began because of you. Because I saw you walk into a room 3 months before any of this started and hold yourself with a kind of dignity that most people would have abandoned under far less pressure, and I could not stop noticing it." His voice was steady and unhurried. "Everything else, Dune, the debt, the column, the gathering, those were problems that needed solving regardless. But the reason I wanted to solve them was because of you specifically. Because I could not reconcile the idea of you being diminished any further by someone who had never deserved you in the first place." Annette was quiet for a moment. "You are a very contained person," she said finally. "I am," he agreed. "It makes it difficult to know what you are feeling." "I am aware of that," he said. "I am working on it." The corner of her mouth moved, just slightly. "How is that going?" Something happened in his eyes. That quiet shift, the one she had been learning to read. "I am sitting here without a speech prepared for the first time in memory," he said. "I think that constitutes meaningful progress." She laughed. It was small and genuine, and it surprised her, the way real laughter always does when it arrives unexpectedly after a long stretch of days that gave it no room to exist. Alaric looked at her when she laughed. He looked at her the way he had been looking at her since the beginning, like someone who had been patient for a very long time and found that every moment of the wait had been worth exactly this. "I would like to call on you," he said, "properly, regularly, with the full and transparent intention of knowing you better and being known by you in return." He paused. "If you are willing." She held his gaze for a long moment. She thought about the girl who had stood in a ballroom with a shattered goblet on the wall behind her and nowhere to look that felt safe. She thought about the woman who had written 12 pages of plain truth and walked into a room and spoken every word of it without flinching. She thought about gardens and letters and a stone path between rose beds and the feeling of placing her hand on someone's arm and feeling, for the first time in 2 years, that the ground beneath her was solid. "I am willing," she said. He breathed out, slowly, and something in his face settled into a warmth she had not seen there before, or perhaps had been seeing all along, and only now had the language to name. Outside, the walled garden held its quiet green beginning. Inside, in the small back sitting room of Pelham House, 2 people sat across from each other, with no scaffolding between them, and the whole unhurried future spreading out like a country neither of them had visited yet, but both of them, finally, were ready to walk into together. Dorian, who had been pretending to read a newspaper in the hallway for the past 20 minutes, allowed himself a very small, very private smile, and went to find the Countess to tell her she could stop pressing her ear to the sitting room door. The Countess was absolutely not pressing her ear to the door. She was, however, standing very close to it. She straightened up with tremendous dignity and said, "I was simply checking the draft," and walked away down the corridor with her hands folded and her chin elevated, which was how she always walked when she had just been caught doing something she intended to deny entirely. And somewhere across the city, in offices and drawing rooms and private clubs, the name of Lord Percival Dune was quietly and systematically becoming the kind of name that people stopped saying in polite company. Not with drama, not with announcement, but with the steady, irreversible momentum of a truth that had finally been given the room to breathe. He had spent 2 years trying to make Annette Vail invisible. Instead, he had made her impossible to ignore. And the Duke, who had been watching silently from the edges of every room, had simply been waiting for her to see what he had always already seen. That she was, and had always been, worth every single moment of the wait. If you enjoyed this story and want to see more, don't forget to subscribe to my channel. Stay tuned for more exciting tales and updates. Your support means the world.